Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you. Today I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable. And I've always been drawn to the idea of escaping into the wilderness, away from the city's constant noise and commotion. So when my friends proposed a camping trip deep into the forest to celebrate the end of our college semester, I was immediately on board. Little did I know this seemingly innocent trip would turn into a nightmarish ordeal that would haunt me for the rest of my life. We were a group of 5, me, my best friend Alex, the ever-cautious Emma, Tom, the joker of the group, and Sarah, the quiet one who seemed almost detached. Our destination was an old campsite near Blackwood Forest, a place famous for its dense woods and stories of mysterious happenings. But as Alex put it, that's just folklore to keep kids away. Nothing to worry about. I wish I hadn't believed him. The first day was perfect. We reached the campsite by late afternoon after a 2-hour hike through narrow, winding trails that seemed almost swallowed by the towering pines. The clearing we found was secluded, surrounded by thick foliage, with a small stream nearby. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and by nightfall a warm fire was crackling in the center of our little circle. The mood was light, laughter and stories filling the air. Tom, as usual, tried to spook us with ghost tales, but Emma quickly dismissed them. "Ghosts aren't real, Tom," she said, rolling her eyes. "But real dangers like bears are, so keep the food sealed tight." It was around midnight when Sarah, who had been silently staring into the fire for a while, finally spoke up. "Have you guys heard of the Whistler?" she asked softly. A hush fell over the group. We leaned in closer as she continued. "It's said that in these woods there's something not quite human. People say it moves like a shadow, and when it's nearby, you can hear a low, eerie whistle. It mimics human voices, calls out your name even, but the worst part, if you hear it and answer back, it'll come for you." Tom scoffed. "Oh please, Sarah, that's just another campfire story. Whistlers, skinwalkers, wendigos, it's all the same crap. There's no such thing." Sarah just shrugged and looked away, but her words lingered in the silence. The firelight seemed to cast long, twisted shadows, and suddenly the darkness beyond our small circle of light felt much closer, almost suffocating. We eventually called it a night, each of us retreating to our tents. I shared one with Alex. As I lay there, staring up at the dark canvas above, I couldn't shake off a growing sense of unease. Every rustle of the leaves outside, every creak of a branch made my heart race. Alex must have noticed because he whispered, "You okay, man?" "Yeah, just Sarah's story. Got to me, I guess," I muttered. "Don't let it. There's nothing out there but trees and animals." "Go to sleep," he murmured back. But I didn't sleep. Not really. My senses were on high alert, and every few minutes I thought I heard faint noises outside. It was probably just the wind, I told myself. Hours passed, and just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it, a low, wavering whistle drifting through the night. I froze. It sounded distant, almost ethereal, like it wasn't part of the forest at all, but something else entirely. I held my breath, listening, hoping it was just my imagination. Then it came again, closer. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, nudging Alex. But he was already sitting up, his eyes wide in the dim light. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." "What the hell?" We stayed silent, straining to listen. The whistling grew louder, clearer. It was almost musical, a haunting melody that seemed to float through the trees. And then it changed. It wasn't just a whistle anymore. It sounded like a voice, garbled and distorted, but unmistakably human. Alex!" We both flinched. It had called his name. "Who's out there?" Alex shouted, his voice trembling slightly. I grabbed his arm, shaking my head vigorously, but it was too late. The forest fell silent. Even the wind seemed to die down. We waited, every nerve on edge. Minutes ticked by. Then from somewhere to our left, there was a soft, shuffling noise. Something, or someone, was moving outside our tent. "Hello?" Alex called again, his voice barely above a whisper now. Another silence, thick and oppressive. And then a voice, low and guttural, mimicking his own words. "Hello?" I felt my blood run cold. It was copying him. The same tone, the same inflection, but warped, twisted. Alex grabbed the flashlight beside him and slowly unzipped the tent. I wanted to stop him, but fear had paralyzed me. He shone the light outside, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing. Just the dark, empty woods. "See, it's probably just someone messing with us," he said, trying to sound confident. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He zipped up the tent again, and we sat there, wide awake, until dawn. The next morning, I expected everyone to be on edge, but to my surprise, Tom and Emma were their usual cheerful selves. Only Sarah seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. When we told them about the whistling, Tom just laughed it off. "It was probably just an owl or something," he said. "You guys are letting Sarah's ghost story mess with your heads." But it hadn't been an owl. I knew that much. Still, I didn't argue. We packed up and decided to go for a hike deeper into the forest, hoping to clear our heads. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled and twisted, blotting out the sun. Every now and then, I thought I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape flitting between the trunks. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Around noon, we stopped by a small clearing to rest. Tom wandered off a bit looking for dry wood for the fire. The rest of us sat down, munching on snacks, when we heard it again, the whistling. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. Tom turned, a grin on his face. "Did you guys hear that? Guess the whistler wants to say hi." "Tom, don't," Sarah whispered, her face pale. But Tom just laughed and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hey, Whistler, come out and show yourself." The whistling stopped. A heavy silence fell over the clearing. Then a voice, eerily similar to Tom's, called back, "Hey, Whistler, come out and show yourself." We all froze. It was identical, every word, every intonation, but it didn't sound right. It was too flat, too empty, like a recording. "What the hell?" Emma muttered. Tom's smile faded. He took a step back, glancing around nervously. "Okay, very funny. Who's messing with us?" No one answered. The woods seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to run as fast as I could. But we stayed, rooted to the spot as if the forest itself was holding us in place. And then, from the trees behind Tom, something moved. A figure stepped out, tall and thin, its form shrouded in darkness. But as it moved into the light, I saw it, saw him. It was Tom, or at least it looked like him. Same face, same clothes, even the same smirk. But his eyes, they were wrong. Empty, hollow, like dark pits in his skull. And when he smiled, it was too wide, the corners of his mouth stretching impossibly far. "Whistler," it said softly, in Tom's voice. My heart lurched. The real Tom staggered back, his face drained of color. "What the?" The thing tilted its head, still smiling that unnatural smile. "What the?" it echoed, perfectly mimicking his tone. We were all on our feet now, backing away slowly. The imposter took a step forward, then another, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled on invisible strings. "Run," I whispered. No one needed telling twice. We turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, that awful, distorted voice, repeating our words, our cries, mocking us. We didn't stop until we burst out of the woods, panting and gasping for air. But when I looked around, I realized with a sinking feeling that something was wrong. Sarah was gone. "Where is she?" Alex shouted, panic rising in his voice. I looked back at the dark line of trees. She hadn't been that far behind us, I was sure of it. But there was no sign of her. No sound, no movement. "We have to go back," I said, my voice shaking. "No way," Tom gasped. "Did you see that thing? It looked like me. What the hell was that?" I had no answer. None of us did, but Sarah was out there, alone. I took a step toward the woods, but Emma grabbed my arm. "Don't," she pleaded. What if that thing is still out there?" I hesitated. Fear clawed at my chest, but I couldn't just leave her. "We have to try," I said finally. "She's our friend." With Alex and Tom reluctantly following, we crept back into the forest, calling her name softly. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves made my heart leap. But there was no response. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into a small, dark clearing. And there, standing in the center, was Sarah. Or at least, it looked like her. She turned slowly, a smile on her face. "Hey guys," she said brightly. "What took you so long?" But something was wrong. The smile was too stiff, too forced. And her eyes, they were dark, bottomless pits, just like the thing that had mimicked Tom. "What's wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. The gesture was almost comical, like a mannequin trying to mimic human behavior. "Sarah?" I whispered. "Yes," she replied, grinning wider. And then, from the trees behind her, something stepped out. Another figure, identical to her in every way. "Sarah?" I whispered again, my voice barely audible. "Yes," the second Sarah answered. The two figures turned to face each other, smiling those empty, hollow smiles. "Run!" I breathed. We didn't wait. We turned and fled, crashing blindly through the forest until we finally burst out into the clearing where our tents were still set up. Without a word, we grabbed our bags and ran, not stopping until we reached the main road. We never spoke of what happened that night. Not to anyone else, not even to each other. But I can't forget. Even now, years later, I still see their faces in my nightmares, those empty, hollow eyes, those twisted smiles. We never found the real Sarah. The rangers searched for days but came up with nothing. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I think I can still hear it. The soft, haunting whistle drifting through the trees, calling my name. They warned us not to camp in Red Hollow Forest. There were countless stories, rumors of people vanishing without a trace, and whispers of eyes that watched from the darkness. But we were young and arrogant, convinced that we were invincible. So when my friend suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the heart of Red Hollow, I didn't hesitate. If only I had listened. We were a group of 4, me, Jake, my closest friend since childhood, Lisa, Jake's girlfriend, and Derek, the adventure enthusiast. Derek had been the one to push for this trip. "It'll be fun," he had said. "A little off-the-grid adventure. We'll have stories to tell for years." We set out on a chilly Friday afternoon, backpacks loaded with supplies and spirits high. The hike took longer than expected. Red Hollow was dense, the trees so tightly packed that it felt like the forest was closing in around us. By the time we found a suitable clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows. We quickly pitched our tents and built a small fire. The flickering flames cast a warm glow, pushing back the creeping darkness. We laughed, shared stories, and Derek, as usual, tried to spook us with tales of the forest's haunted history. According to him, Red Hollow was once home to a small village that mysteriously disappeared in the 1800s. The villagers were said to have been cursed, their souls trapped in the woods, forever watching.
Come on, Derek, Lisa scoffed. You're not seriously expecting us to believe that, are you? Derek just grinned. Believe what you want, but keep an eye out tonight. They say you can see their eyes in the trees if you look closely.
I glanced around, suddenly uneasy. The firelight didn't seem as comforting anymore. Beyond its glow, the forest was pitch black, a wall of shadows that seemed almost alive. I shook off the feeling and forced a laugh. Yeah, right. Well, if any ghost villagers want to join us, I hope they're bringing marshmallows. The others chuckled, and the tension eased a little. But that night, as we lay in our tents, I couldn't sleep. There was something wrong about the silence outside. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was oppressive, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, I thought I heard a faint rustling outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right beside my tent. A soft, shuffling noise like something moving in the underbrush. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, heart pounding. "Jake," I whispered, hoping he was awake. But there was no response from the other tent. I swallowed hard and reached for the flashlight beside me, then cautiously unzipped the tent flap. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty woods. I let out a shaky breath and stepped outside, my eyes scanning the shadows. The air was cold, the kind of cold that bites through your clothes and chills your bones. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight in a wide arc. And then I saw them, eyes, dozens of them gleaming faintly in the dark, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. They were everywhere, scattered among the trees, staring at me from the shadows. My heart slammed against my ribs. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things, but when I opened my eyes, they were still there. "Guys!" I called out, my voice shaking. A rustling sound came from behind me, and I whipped around, the flashlight's beam dancing wildly. More eyes stared back at me. I stumbled backward, panic rising. They were watching, unblinking from every direction. "What the hell?" I breathed. "Hey, what's going on?" Jake's voice broke through the silence, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. He emerged from his tent, rubbing his eyes groggily. But when he saw my expression, he frowned. "What's wrong?" "Do you see them?" I whispered, pointing with a trembling hand. He followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then his eyes widened. "Holy shit!" The others were awake now, scrambling out of their tents, confused and alarmed. "What's going on?" Lisa demanded, clutching her jacket tightly around her. "Look," Jake said hoarsely, gesturing at the trees. Derek stepped forward, peering into the darkness. His face went pale. What are those?" "Eyes," I whispered. "They're watching us." For a long moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the countless glowing orbs surrounding us. They were too high to be animals, and there were too many of them. No sound, no movement, just watching. Okay, everyone stay calm," Derek said, his voice strained. "It's probably just some sort of reflection, maybe fireflies or something." But we all knew that wasn't true. Fireflies don't move in perfect unison. Fireflies don't stare. Let's go back inside the tents," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe if we ignore them, they'll go away." It was a weak plan, but none of us had a better idea. We backed slowly into our tents, zipping them shut. I lay there, heart racing, listening to the silence outside. The eyes hadn't moved. They were still there, I could feel it. Watching, waiting. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those cold, unblinking eyes. Hours seemed to crawl by, and I began to think morning would never come. But eventually a pale light filtered through the tent's fabric. I scrambled out, blinking in the early dawn. The forest was still and quiet, bathed in a soft, misty light. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The eyes were gone. Did anyone else see them? I asked softly. Jake nodded, his face pale. Yeah, they were real. We all saw them. What do we do? Lisa whispered. She looked terrified, her eyes darting around the clearing. We leave, Derek said firmly. Now! I don't know what that was, but I'm not sticking around to find out. No one argued. We packed up quickly, stuffing our gear into our bags. But as we turned to head back toward the trail, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They were scattered all around the campsite, overlapping and crisscrossing in chaotic patterns. Human footprints, bare feet, some small like those of a child, others larger like a grown man's, and they weren't ours. They led in and out of the trees, circling our tents, converging in the spots where we had seen the eyes.
Oh my God, Lisa breathed, staring at the ground. Let's go, I said urgently. Now! We hurried along the narrow path, our eyes darting around nervously. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive, even in the daylight. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister.
After an hour of tense, silent hiking, we finally reached the main trail. Relief washed over me. We were almost out. Just a little further, and we'd be back in the open, away from this cursed place. But as we rounded the bend, something caught my eye. A figure standing in the middle of the trail. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was a man, tall, thin, with pale, sallow skin. He was wearing old-fashioned clothes, torn, dirty, stained with something dark. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but the worst part was his smile. It was wide, impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear. "Hello," he whispered, his voice raspy and dry. "Are you lost?" No, we're just..." Derek stammered, backing away. "Leaving?" The man's smile widened. "But you just got here." Behind him, the trees shifted. Figures stepped out of the shadows, dozens of them, men, women, children, all pale, all smiling that same terrible smile. Their eyes were black voids, staring unblinking. "We're always watching," the man whispered, "and now, so are you." My legs moved before I could think. We turned and ran, sprinting down the trail, branches whipping at our faces. The sounds of soft footsteps echoed behind us, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. We burst out of the forest and into the clearing by the parking lot, gasping for air. But when I turned to look back, the trail was empty. We never spoke of what happened in Red Hollow. We never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I see them. Those eyes watching from the darkness. And I know they're still out there. Waiting. Watching. Always. There's a lake deep in the woods that no one visits anymore. Locals call it Stillwater Lake. But growing up, my grandmother always called it the Silent Lake. She told me stories about how, years ago, people used to camp there, swim, and fish. But then one day, a young couple drowned under mysterious circumstances. After that, strange things began happening around the lake. Whispers heard late at night, shadows moving under the water. Eventually, people stopped going. It's been abandoned for decades now, left to the wilderness. So naturally, when my friends suggested camping there for the weekend, I was hesitant. "Come on, Jess," Mark urged, flashing his usual confident grin. "It's just an old wives' tale. There's nothing out there but fish and water. You really believe in ghost stories?" I glanced at my other two friends, Amanda and Kyle, hoping they'd back me up, but they seemed just as eager. I sighed. "Fine, but if something creepy happens, I'm blaming you, Mark." Mark just laughed and gave me a playful nudge. "You won't regret it. It's going to be fun, you'll see." We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already low in the sky. The trail leading to the lake was overgrown, branches and brambles snagging at our clothes. The closer we got, the more isolated it felt. The trees seemed to press in around us, their twisted branches blocking out the light. When we finally broke through the dense foliage, Stillwater Lake lay before us. It was beautiful, in a desolate sort of way. The water was glassy and still, reflecting the fiery orange of the sunset. But there was something unnerving about how calm it was. No ripples, no movement, just stillness. "See?" Mark said, throwing down his backpack. "Nothing to worry about, it's just a lake." "Yeah," Amanda agreed, though she looked a bit uneasy too. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark." We pitched our tents a few yards from the shore and gathered firewood for a small campfire. As night fell, the lake seemed to vanish into the darkness, its surface blending seamlessly with the black sky. The silence was oppressive. There were no crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just an endless, heavy stillness. "Creepy, isn't it?" Kyle murmured, staring out at the water. "Maybe a little," I admitted. "But I guess it's peaceful too." We tried to lighten the mood with jokes and ghost stories, but it felt forced. The quiet pressed in on us, making every crack of a twig or snap of a branch seem magnified. Around midnight, Amanda yawned and stretched. "I'm calling it a night," she said, standing up. "See you guys in the morning." Kyle followed her lead, mumbling something about getting some sleep before our hike the next day. I watched them disappear into their tents, leaving just me and Mark by the dying fire. "So," Mark said, leaning back and staring at the dark lake. "You still scared?" "I'm not scared," I muttered, hugging my knees. "Just uneasy." He chuckled softly. "Well, nothing's going to happen. You'll see. By tomorrow, you'll be wondering what you were so worried about." I didn't respond. Something about the lake, the utter, unnatural stillness of it, put me on edge. I found myself staring at the water, half expecting to see something. Something that shouldn't be there. Mark must have sensed my unease because he sighed and stood up. "Fine, I'll prove it to you." "What are you doing?" I asked, as he walked toward the water's edge. "Going for a swim," he called over his shoulder. "Mark, don't!" I scrambled to my feet. The water's probably freezing, and we don't know how deep it is. But he just laughed, kicking off his shoes and wading in. "Relax, Jess. It's just a lake. See? Nothing's gonna—" His voice cut off abruptly. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Mark?" I whispered. He was standing waist-deep in the water, staring down at his legs. The muscles in his back were tense, his shoulders hunched. "What's wrong?" I took a step forward, but he didn't answer. "Mark, you're scaring me," I said, my voice trembling. Slowly, he turned to look at me, his face pale in the moonlight. Something touched me. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't respond. His gaze shifted back to the water, and for a moment, we both stood there, staring at the still surface. Then, without warning, he jerked backward, splashing frantically. "Something's pulling me!" he shouted, his voice rising in panic. I ran forward, grabbing his arm. The water was freezing like ice, numbing my hands instantly. I pulled with all my strength, my fingers digging into his skin. For a second, he seemed to be free. But then a dark shape shifted beneath the water, a shadow, long and sinuous like a hand made of darkness. Mark screamed, and then he was yanked under. "Mark!" I shrieked, plunging into the water after him, but he was gone. The surface closed over him, smooth and unbroken. I thrashed, my fingers clawing at the water, but there was nothing. No sign of him, just the empty, silent lake. "No, no, no," I sobbed, stumbling back to shore. "Mark! Mark!" The others burst out of their tents, their faces pale and scared. "What happened?" Amanda cried, looking between me and the dark water. He, I stammered, pointing wildly. "Something pulled him under. We have to help him." But there was no sign of Mark. No bubbles, no ripples, just the dark, still water reflecting the moon's cold light. We searched for hours, calling his name, shining flashlights into the depths. But there was no response. Finally, as dawn broke, we collapsed by the shore, exhausted and terrified. "He's gone," Kyle whispered, staring blankly at the lake. "We have to leave, now." But as we turned to pack up, Amanda froze, her eyes widening. "Wait," she whispered, pointing. We turned slowly, following her gaze. There, standing in the shallows, was Mark. "Mark!" I cried, stumbling forward. But something stopped me. Something in the way he was standing, too still, too rigid. His head was bowed, his hair dripping wet. And then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were wide, staring, but they didn't seem to see us. They were empty, like dark holes in his skull. His lips parted, and in a low, hollow voice, he whispered, "The lake. It wants more." I felt my blood run cold. "Mark," I whispered, my voice shaking, but he didn't respond. Slowly, mechanically, he turned and began to walk deeper into the water, his steps slow and deliberate. The water rose around his waist, his chest, his shoulders. We stood there, paralyzed as it closed over his head, and he disappeared beneath the surface. Silence. And then, from the depths, a low, guttural whisper. More. We ran. We didn't stop to pack, didn't look back. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush until we finally broke free of the woods and stumbled onto the old gravel road. We never went back. We never spoke of it again. But I still dream of that lake sometimes, dream of Mark, standing in the water, his empty eyes staring, his lips moving soundlessly. And I know deep down that it's still out there, waiting for more. There's a cabin deep in the woods, far off the beaten trail. Most locals don't know it's there, and those who do refuse to talk about it. They say it's cursed, that anyone who spends the night there comes back. Different. I'd heard the stories all my life, dismissed them as the usual small-town folklore. But when my college roommate Nate found the old map marking its location, I couldn't resist. "Come on, Jake," he urged, grinning from ear to ear. "It'll be fun. A weekend camping trip to a place no one's been in years. We'll get to say we survived the Whispering Cabin." I should have said no. I should have burned that map and forgotten the whole idea. But I didn't. Instead, I agreed. And that's how we found ourselves hiking through the dense, tangled woods one chilly Friday evening. Our group consisted of 4, me, Nate, Lily, Nate's girlfriend, and Ryan, my best friend, since freshman year. The hike was grueling, the trail overgrown and barely visible, but after a few hours of trekking, we finally stumbled into a small clearing. There it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, just a squat, weather-beaten structure nestled among the trees. The wooden walls were grey and rotting, the windows covered in grime. There was something wrong about the way it sat there, hunched and dark, like it was waiting for us. "Well, here we are," Nate said cheerfully, dropping his pack. "Home sweet home for the weekend." "Lovely," Lily muttered, eyeing the cabin warily. "This place looks like it's about to fall apart." "It's fine," Nate insisted. "It'll just be for one night. Tomorrow we'll hike back and tell everyone about our adventure." I glanced at Ryan, hoping for some backup, but he just shrugged. "Might as well," he said. "We came all this way." So, reluctantly, I followed them inside. The interior was worse than the outside. The air was thick with dust, and a musty, rotting smell permeated the tiny space. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet. There was no furniture, just empty space and shadow. But the strangest part was the markings on the walls, long, deep scratches, as if something with claws had tried to tear its way out. "What the hell made those?" Lily asked, her voice hushed. "Probably just animals," Nate said dismissively, though I noticed he didn't seem quite as confident as before. "Yeah, right," Ryan muttered, running his fingers over the gouges. "Unless raccoons started carrying machetes." I shivered, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. "Let's just set up our stuff and get a fire going," I suggested. "It's getting dark." We built a small fire just outside the cabin and tried to keep the mood light, sharing ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. But it felt forced. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin behind us. "Didn't you say this place was called the Whispering Cabin?" Ryan asked suddenly, breaking the uneasy silence. Nate glanced up, startled. "Yeah, why?" "Then why's it so damn quiet?" Ryan said, his eyes darting around the clearing. "I thought we'd at least hear something. Whispers, voices. I don't know. Something. Maybe it's just a name," I said, though I wasn't convinced. "Maybe it's just..." A sound cut me off. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a breath of wind or a faint sigh. "Did you guys hear that?" Lily whispered, eyes wide. We all froze, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing. Then faintly, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, I heard it again. A whisper. It was so soft it was almost more of a feeling than a sound, a low murmur drifting through the trees. My skin prickled, my mouth going dry.
"Who's there?" Nate called, standing up. His voice sounded too loud, jarring in the oppressive stillness. No answer, just the whisper, growing slightly louder. I couldn't make out any words, just the soft, insistent hissing, like something was trying to speak from just out of earshot.
"Let's go inside," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. "It's getting cold." No one argued. We doused the fire and retreated into the cabin, closing the door behind us. The whispering stopped as soon as we stepped inside, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It felt wrong. Like something was holding its breath, waiting. We set up our sleeping bags in a rough circle on the floor, our flashlights casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. No one spoke. We just lay there, staring up at the rotting ceiling, listening to the creak and groan of the old wood.
I don't know how long I lay there, my eyes heavy with exhaustion but my mind racing. It felt like hours. The darkness seemed to press down around us, thick and suffocating. And then I heard it again. A whisper coming from somewhere above us. I sat up, heart pounding, and shone my flashlight at the ceiling.
The beam illuminated nothing but bare, dusty wood. But the whispering continued, soft, insistent, like a conversation I couldn't quite catch. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, glancing at the others. Lily was already sitting up, her face pale in the dim light. "It's coming from the walls," she whispered. We all turned, our flashlights sweeping across the scratched, scarred wood. And then we saw it, the shadows. They were faint, almost imperceptible at first. But as we watched, they seemed to shift and move, writhing like smoke trapped behind the wood. Dark shapes pressing against the walls from the inside. "What the hell?" Ryan breathed, stumbling backward. The whispering grew louder, rising in pitch, the words still unintelligible but filled with a desperate urgency. The shadows pulsed, pressing harder against the wood, the deep gouges seeming to stretch and warp. "We need to get out," I gasped, scrambling to my feet. "Now!" But before we could move, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all jumped, whirling around. Who did that?" Nate stammered. No one answered. The door was closed, the latch rusted and unmoving. But as we watched, the shadows on the walls shifted again, gathering, coalescing into a single, twisting shape. And then, slowly it turned. Eyes. There were eyes in the shadows, staring at us, empty, hollow, and filled with a terrible, burning hunger. "Run!" I shouted, lunging for the door. I yanked at the latch, my fingers slipping on the cold metal, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the whispering rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices screaming and hissing. Nate grabbed my arm, his face a mask of terror. "The window!" he shouted, pulling me toward the small, broken window near the back of the cabin. We scrambled through, the glass cutting into our hands and legs. Ryan and Lily were right behind us, their faces pale with fear. We didn't look back. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, the whispers still ringing in our ears. We didn't stop until we reached the road, gasping for breath. The forest was silent again, the oppressive stillness returning. But I could still feel it. The eyes watching us from the shadows. We never spoke of what happened in that cabin. We never told anyone. But I can still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone. And I know that whatever was in that cabin is still there, trapped behind those rotting walls, waiting, whispering, always. When my brother Lucas suggested a camping trip in the remote Pine Ridge forest, I thought it would be a perfect getaway from city life, a chance to clear our heads and spend some quality time together. The forest was vast and wild, largely untouched by hikers or tourists. There were whispers that the area was... "It'll be fine, Anna," Lucas assured me as we packed the car. "There's a trail we can follow, just a weekend in nature, and then we'll be back to our boring lives." I smiled, nodding in agreement. What could go wrong? We set off early the next morning, reaching the forest by noon. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine and earth filled my lungs. Everything was serene, untouched, almost too perfect. We parked the car at the base of a narrow dirt trail and began our hike. The trail wound through dense trees and rocky terrain, the sunlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above. We walked for hours, talking and laughing, the miles slipping away behind us. But as the afternoon wore on, a strange unease began to creep over me. "Lucas, are you sure we're on the right path?" I asked, glancing around nervously. "Of course," he replied, though his voice held a hint of uncertainty. "The trail's marked on the map. We should reach a clearing soon." But we didn't. Instead, the trail began to narrow, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The trees seemed closer together, their branches tangled overhead like skeletal fingers. And the deeper we went, the more the world seemed to close in around us. After another hour, we came upon a fork in the path, two trails diverging sharply in opposite directions. Lucas frowned, pulling out his map. He traced his finger over the paper, then shook his head. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. "There shouldn't be a fork here." "What do you mean?" I asked. feeling a chill creep down my spine. He didn't answer, just stared at the map, then back at the trails. The map says there's only one path. We should be going straight. But there's no straight path, I said, my voice rising slightly. What are we supposed to do? Lucas hesitated, then pointed to the left fork. We go this way. It's probably just a small deviation. We'll find our way back. Reluctantly, I followed him. But with each step, the forest seemed to change around us. The air grew colder, the trees taller and darker. The sunlight filtering through the branches took on a sickly, greenish hue. And then I noticed something strange. The trail behind us. It was gone. "Lucas," I whispered, my heart pounding. "Look." He turned, his face paling. Where we had walked just moments ago was now a solid wall of trees, the trail we'd followed swallowed by the forest. There was no sign of where we'd come from, just thick, twisted trunks and brambles.
"That's not possible," he murmured, stepping forward and pushing at the branches. But they didn't budge. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself, cutting us off. We must have taken a wrong turn," he said, trying to sound confident. "Let's just keep moving."
We pressed on, choosing random paths whenever the trail forked, hoping to find our way back. But the forest seemed endless, an impenetrable maze of twisted trees and silent shadows. Hours passed, the light dimming as the sun set behind the thick canopy. And then we came upon something that made my blood run cold. A campsite, our campsite. The same fallen log we'd sat on earlier, the same rock I'd stubbed my toe on. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, right down to the empty water bottles by the tree. "How is this possible?" I whispered, staring at the familiar clearing. "We've been walking for hours. How did we end up back here?" Lucas was silent, his face drawn and pale. He looked around slowly, as if seeing the forest for the first time. And then he pointed. "Look, there, on one of the trees bordering the clearing, was a symbol, a strange, twisting mark carved deep into the bark. It looked almost like a spiral, but the lines were jagged, uneven. And there, at the very center, was a small, dark hole. What the hell is that?" I breathed, stepping closer. Lucas grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Don't touch it." "What's going on, Lucas?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What is that thing?" He didn't answer, just stared at the symbol with a look of dawning horror. "We need to leave. Now!" We turned and ran, plunging into the woods without any sense of direction. I didn't care where we were going, I just wanted to get away from that symbol, from the eerie, unnatural clearing that seemed to trap us in its grasp. The branches tore at our clothes, the ground uneven and treacherous, but we didn't stop. And then we heard it, a low, distant humming, like the drone of insects, but deeper, almost mechanical. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the trees, through the ground, through my bones. The sound grew louder, reverberating in my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. "Lucas, what is that?" I gasped, clutching my head.
"I don't know," he shouted, his voice almost drowned out by the noise. "Just keep moving." But the forest seemed to twist and shift around us, every turn leading back to the same clearing, the same symbol carved into the same tree. No matter how far we ran, how many times we changed direction, we always ended up back there.
"We're trapped," I whispered, sinking to my knees. "We're never going to get out." "Don't say that," Lucas snapped, though his voice trembled. "There has to be a way out. There has to—" The humming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I looked up, my ears ringing, and saw Lucas frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. Something was moving between the trees, a dark shape, low and sinuous, its body blending with the shadows. It slid through the undergrowth, circling us, its movements unnaturally smooth. I couldn't make out its form, just a vague impression of something large and wrong. And then it whispered, "Stay with us." The voice was soft, almost gentle. But there was something in it, something that made my skin crawl, my stomach twist. The thing moved closer, its shape shifting, warping. "Stay. Forever." I scrambled back, my hands digging into the dirt. "Lucas, we have to go." But he was staring at the creature, his face blank, his eyes wide and empty.
"Lucas!" I screamed, grabbing his arm. "We have to run!" He didn't move, didn't even seem to hear me. Slowly, mechanically, he began to walk toward the thing, his steps slow and deliberate. "No!" I yanked at him, my nails digging into his skin. "Don't go near it!"
But he kept moving, his gaze locked on the creature, his face slack and vacant. And then before I could react, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around him, swallowing him whole. "Lucas!" I screamed, lunging forward. But it was too late. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees leaning closer, the shadows deepening. And then I heard it again, the whispering. "Stay." I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, not caring if I ever found the trail. I just ran, the whispers chasing me, the thing moving silently through the trees. I don't know how long I ran, hours maybe, days, but eventually the trees thinned, and I burst out onto a dirt road, gasping for breath. I never found Lucas. The search parties combed the